Joining us now on the line is Michael Kay, who is an international affairs reporter, former advisor to the UK's Ministry of Defence, and is a editor at large as well. Hey, Michael, it's so good to have you here, but we want to start out by talking about Ukraine.
Morning, Brian and Larry. How are you?
Good morning. Bob Gates, our former Secretary of Defense, said this weekend on one of the Sunday talk shows that the Crimea region was lost. What's your assessment of it?
I think geopolitics moves fast, and I think that's what we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Now, one thing I would say, and one thing I'm keen to say, is that there's no silver bullet to this crisis. The first thing is that the crisis will not be diffused by flexing of military muscles, and I think people generally acknowledge that. I'm confident of that, and I think stock markets as well are also confident of that in the way that they've been reacting over the last week. But what I will say is that there's an inconsistency in the way that sovereign territories have approached the debate on self-determination and the way that referendums have been approached. And you've just got to look back to contemporary history and look at the way various sovereign nations around the world have looked at sort of these issues. If you look at the way that Kosovo was annexed from Serbia, Russia didn't want the annexation in this case, and the US did. They are very different in terms of the individual characteristics, I agree. But then you look at Britain and you look at the annexation of Scotland. There was a referendum on the Falkland Islands last year. If you go to South Sudan and Sudan, that again is a referendum in itself, and South Sudan has been annexed from Sudan. You've got Chechnya in Russia. You've got Catalonia in Spain. There's lots of examples of the way that various territories have been annexed from a sovereign territory. Now, there are two key factors here that I think that we really need to focus on and act upon, bearing in mind our previous history. And when I say our, I mean Britain and the US. The first one is the invasion of a sovereign territory. It's illegal. And in international law, that is illegal. And so I think what the US should be doing is forcing the UN Security Council and Ban Ki-moon to take a view on this. You're not going to get a resolution from it because obviously Russia formed part of the P5.
Right.
But what you will do is you will show Russia that there is vehement opposition at the international level. It'll probably be the P5+1, which includes Germany, which will place pressure on Putin. That's the diplomatic side.
Right.
Referendum-wise, I think we shouldn't accept that there should be a referendum on March the 16th, because the bottom line is that Kiev and Ukraine don't acknowledge it. They are not happy with the fact that there's a referendum going on. We also don't know whether the entire population of Crimea wants a referendum. There should be a vote to begin with in Crimea to say, should Crimea remain a part of Ukraine, yes or no?
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then it should go to a referendum, because, what are the options going to be? Is it going to be annexation to Russia? Is it going to be to remain a part of the Ukraine? Is it going to be for independence? Because all of these outcomes have unintended consequences. And what I mean by unintended consequences is, if we look at what's going on in the North Caucasus region at the moment, there is a severe terrorist problem that Putin is facing. If you look at Syria, there is a severe Islamic terrorist problem that is going on. And what these two locations are doing is they're pulling foreign fighters from all over the world to pick up arms and fight the jihadist threat. Now, in Crimea, there's an Islamic minority called the Crimean Tatars. Now, they are actually a peaceful minority, but they have chosen to live in Crimea under Ukraine government. Now, if Crimea suddenly goes back to Russia, you've then got a minority that is very unhappy, and this minority has been brutalized by Russia. And so you could see some sort of situation like Syria where jihadis are coming into Crimea to fight a cause, and that's not good.
Yeah, I feel like I just got a lesson in world politics there. Thank you.
Well, Michael Kay, no, not at all. I mean, listen, you're a former advisor to the Ministry of Defense there, so I want to ask you about your take on this Malaysian airliner disappearance. But first, a quick question back on Ukraine. Prime Minister David Cameron, he tweeted out a picture of himself speaking on the phone to President Obama. He was looking very serious, and he was roundly ridiculed and mocked all over social media for that. And they're suggesting, really, that Prime Minister Cameron is trying to act like he's a big player in this story. But is there any stomach over there on 10 Downing Street for jumping into this and actually leading the European Union in some sort of action and response toward Vladimir Putin? Or is there really, do the Brits not want to have anything to do with this?
Look, I think that's a great question, actually. Being a Brit myself, I do think that Britain is, on occasion, punching above its weight in terms of, the size of its economy, in terms of just the influence that it has around the world. But that said, it still has a seat on the P5. It's still a very credible nuclear power, and it still has big influence within the European Union in terms of the way that it's actually pulled itself away from the European Union, and it hasn't been embroiled in the sovereign debt crisis in the euro directly. So I think it's made some sort of key decisions over the last 20 years with Europe, and not been dragged down by the European Union problem, which, as we all know, is that you've got the likes of Germany and Greece lumped into the same organisation.
Yes.
One is an economic powerhouse, and the other is an economic drain, and they both operate on the same currency. And as we know, when economies change, when economies do well, the currencies fluctuate and the foreign exchange fluctuate, and then it sort of balances out the imports and the exports accordingly. But in answer to your question, I still think the UK has an important part to play in diplomacy around the world, and I think it has to be, very careful the way it manages its relationship with the US. I don't think economically anymore there's a special relationship between Britain and the US. I think it's very much a security relationship.
Oh, interesting.
I need to get in here for a moment before we run out of time, because I just got to ask you about this missing Malaysian plane.
Yeah.
We got about a minute left. What's your thought?
Okay, well, look, I've got 3,500 hours flying in the military. I'm a military helicopter pilot for 20 years. I've flown in the most austere conditions in the world, from the Arctic Circle, the deserts and the jungle. This is very, very strange to me. I've operated on boards of inquiry. There are a couple of things that I think we really need to take away. Look at the Air France 447 flight, okay? Because what this flight tells me is that the pilots, the crew, knew nothing of what was about to happen. And there's a similar story here with Air France 447 with the pitot tubes. And the pitot tubes got iced up. And then what happens is your airspeed indicators act as altimeters. There was confusion in the cockpit. They entered a huge storm. They descended from 35,000 feet within 3 minutes. I think there's a similar situation that's gone on where the crew wasn't aware of the situation that was occurring around them because of the technology that occurred in the cockpit. And what happened with France 447 is that because of the pitot tube that filled up with ice, and it affected the airspeed indicator.
So you think this may be pilot error and not terrorism?
I don't think this is terrorism. I think, people jump to that conclusion when we start talking about false passports. I've been advocating all along that people operate under false passports all the time through human trafficking, illegal immigration, international crime. I can understand why people do jump to the terrorist aspect, because that's what the news 24 hours news cycle reports on every day. But I don't think at this point it is right. I think it's speculation if we go to terrorism, and I think we should look to other factors first before we jump to the terrorism conclusion.
We're going to leave it right there.
Thank you, Michael Gay. Great stuff.
Great stuff. Really appreciate you joining us here this morning.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.